So now, week 5, we move on to Charles Hartshorne's Time, Death, and Eternal Life. Just 1 week talking about what is, of course, a very important issue relating to mortality and death, and that is life after death, the prospect of immortality. I would like to do this, do more readings on the subject and go on for a few more weeks, but unfortunately, especially in a summer class, we just don't have time, so this will be our one reading that will focus exclusively on this issue. He begins this reading by saying, "Our lives on earth are finite in space and in time." We should know what finite means in its different related senses. Finite here means limited, not infinite. Infinite is that which has no boundaries. Finite is that which is defined, something which is limited. So to be finite in space means that we have limits in space. We do not take up all space, and we take up a definite part of space at any time. So we're in a place, and as he says a little later, we have neighbors. That is, there are things that are in other places that are spatially related to us. Unlike God, that's what he's trying to say, where God is infinite in the sense, in some paradoxical way, is everywhere at the same time. So we are not that. We are also then, he says, finite in time, which means that we have a beginning and an end. We do not exist during all time. So we start with a premise. What is he getting at, and how is he, as he will, going to argue then that immortality is real in a certain sense? Now, he will argue that, and by the end of it, we'll have a sense of what Hartshorne's idea of personal immortality is. It may not satisfy us completely. I think it's bound to disappoint us on some level, but he will be arguing that we have an existence, a continued existence after death, and exactly how he's going to get there is really the object of these talks. So he says it's pretty clear that we're finite in space. He says in the second paragraph, the conclusion so far is that our spatial finitude is the truism, the obvious truth, that we are neither the total universe nor deity. We're not the universe, we're not God. But then he asks the question in the second column, how is it with temporal finitude? That is, well, he says pretty clearly we haven't always existed. That doesn't make any sense. We couldn't be human beings if we had always existed, because to be a human being is, in some sense, to be situated in time and to be a product of your culture and your experience, and this is just unimaginable for us if we had always existed, or even if we had existed for a lot longer than we have. And in this respect, you might think of Jonas's point that a human being can only absorb a certain amount of experience before they lose their identity as that particular human being they started as. So he says at the end of that paragraph on the second column, so one cannot focus into this human personality the ideas and purposes of diverse centuries, let alone all centuries. So clearly he believes that we're finite with respect to our beginning as human beings, that is, we begin at a certain time. The real interesting part of the opening comes in the next paragraph. He says, it seems then that temporal and spatial finitude have in some respects the same truistic meaning. That is, it's obvious that we're finite spatially. It's obvious that we're finite temporally. That is, with respect to time. He continues, I am not the universe or God. Hence, of course, I am not everywhere. And of course, I am not primordial, but rather a being whose existence began at a certain moment of time. However, when we consider temporal limitation with regard to the future rather than the past, there seems to be an additional question at issue. So, we're looking at our temporal finitude. We're admitting that, at least in terms of our beginnings, we are finite. That is, we came into existence at a certain time. We are not primordial. We are not the same age as, in any way, conceivable as the universe itself. But what about the future rather than the past? That is, with regard to the past, I'm finite. But with regard to the future and my future, am I finite? Well, one may say, it's kind of obvious, we die. This was obvious from Jonas' point of view, that being mortal creatures, we are creatures whose deaths are inevitable and who are limited in that respect in terms of our life experience. But for Hartshorne, who also accepts that we die, certainly mortality, with respect to our future, with respect to our future in time, are we finite in the same way as we're finite in terms of our beginnings, where before we were born we didn't exist in any form, he says. After we die, is there some sense in which we still exist? That seems to be the question with regard to the future. Makes a very important point in that passage on page 98, in the first column towards the top. Something that exists in a small corner of the world nevertheless does exist there. It is not everything, but it is certainly something. But what once existed and now has ceased to exist is apparently not only limited in scope, it even appears not to exist at all. That is, we say that something exists, and then when it ceases to exist, it seems to have no existence at all anymore. Is it something or is it nothing? If you reply that it was once something, but that now it is nothing, you have scarcely clarified the matter. For something cannot literally become nothing. The word nothing and the word Washington clearly do not have the same referent. Surely, even now when I say Washington, what I refer to is not mere non-entity, and yet, in what sense, is the no longer existent nevertheless still something? That's the whole paper right there. That's the whole essay. That's the germ of the idea. It's the essence of what Hartshorne is dealing with. That sense. In what sense is the no longer existent nevertheless still something? Now, what he's going to argue is that the no longer existent is nevertheless still something. And in that passage is this very, very key point. He said, when he says that the word nothing and the word Washington clearly do not have the same referent. Now, referent for the philosopher is the thing in the world which a word or term is referring to. So if I say in context, the apple in my hand, the referent of that expression, the apple in my hand, is this. Words, symbols, expressions are just what they are, and the notion is that they refer to objects in the world, that they have this referential role. So when I say the word nothing and when I say the word Washington, he is claiming clearly the referent is not the same. Now, it's paradoxical. What is the referent of the word nothing? That would take us way beyond my philosophical abilities. But what he seems to be saying is that when I say the word Washington or George Washington the first president of the United States, that I am referring to something and not nothing. That's very, very important for his argument. I don't know. It really is the foundation of everything that is to come. So it bears a lot of thought. How far can this get him? So we refer to someone who is clearly dead, but when we refer to them, there is a referent. That is, we are not simply referring into thin air, seemingly, like when we use the word nothing. Whether nothing has a referent, I don't know. But what he's saying is clearly the referent of nothing and the referent of George Washington, just Washington, context, is not the same. So we start there, and then of course the question is, well, Washington's been dead for a long time, and so what is it exactly when we refer to Washington that we are referring to?